All right, so welcome everybody to the special six-part series on process and event with Alexander Barth. My name is Thomas Mark. I'm very happy that you're all here and share with us this journey into the, I don't know, the unknown, maybe. Alexander, thank you so much for coming and
Thank you
doing
for
this
having
with
me.
us.
And I should point out that Tom is not only a great philosopher on his own, he is also the official German translator of the last three books from Bruno Söderqvist, including Process and Event. So he's really more into the books, even more than the authors are, to be honest about it. So I couldn't think of a better part to do this with than Tom.
Thank you so much. It's a great book. It's the third part of the second trilogy. So it's rounding up 10, 15 years of philosophical thought, if I get that right.
Yeah, I think it summarizes what John and I've been doing for the last 30 years, actually. That's what we do, Process and Event. And
right.
I think John is right. He put a curse on me. We published the book last fall and said, after this one word, there's nothing but commentary left for you and me until we die, because this is the big one. And I agree with him on that one.
So this whole thing I want to add is a little bit of an experiment, because we thought if we do like a proper course, or if we do like an more open seminar, which works in the way that I give some prompts to Alexander, which are kind of pre-structured, but we also see if something new emerges here. So it's a little bit of an experiment and a little bit of, a playful way to deal with this format of an online conference, of an online seminar. Right.
And we also should point out that we wanted some 15 to 20 participants to then go interactive during the second half, where I think we're plus 20 now, but this is perfect. So all of you who came here today, wonderful, most welcome, because this is exactly how we planned it. So let's go interactive on the second half.
Right. Okay. So again, 45, 60 minutes of talk between you and me, Alexander, and then we open it up and everybody can chime in and ask questions or bring in comments or whatnot. Okay, so let's start. We structured that every one of these six parts has a special topic we want to zoom in a kind of way. And I thought the most easy way, because the book is titled Process and Event, is to ask you, Alexander, what is a process and what is an event?
Okay, first of all, let me cheer you on. Here, I'm supposedly a continental philosopher, so I took that seriously today and brought cheese and salami and wine, European, very continental. And I'm also an armchair philosopher, which is supposed to be derogatory. I think today we should allow ourselves to be armchair philosophers and be proud of it. We are literally philosophers in armchairs, and we're not out there in the world. We love doing theory, so this is what we love to do. So cheers to that. Okay, the premise of the title is very basic, but very fundamental. The question is, what is the most important difference? Of all differences we could possibly think of, what is the most important difference? And once you've decided that time is primary to space, you also realize that process is fundamental to reality. And process historically is called the eternal return of the same, to quote Nietzsche. So things that come back to the same point are processes. And in this fundamental way, of course, the seasons are processes, our lives are processes. We're born, we live, and we die. And before we die, other people are born and they live and they die. So everything is being repeated. And this is process. And fundamentally, this is Indian thinking more than anything else. Hinduism is a process religion. The question is then, is there an alternative to the process? And it turns out that a little guy named Zoroaster in Persia, about 3,700 years ago, so this is 1700 before Christ, invented something called philosophy. And later the Greeks inherited that, and the Greeks picked it up 1,200 years later, except Europeans haven't figured that out. The Persians invented philosophy. But philosophy was invented by Zoroaster. And he invented philosophy simply by saying that, okay, so if everything returns to the same and process exists, something could happen that would change history forever. So history would be something entirely different. It would be a different process. And this is the idea of the event. And when you think about the history of thinking itself, it can only be these two things, the process and the event. And what we're arguing in this book is that the tragedy of the West and the tragedy of the East are mirrors of each other. The tragedy of the East was that it went with India, and went with the process and skipped the event entirely. And basically, therefore, Eastern thinking is process thinking. Whereas the West eventually skipped the process and went with event only. After Zoroastrianism, we developed the Abrahamic religions, and especially Islamic Christianity have always been focused on the event. They're obsessed with the event. Whenever Muhammad stormed Mecca, or whenever Christ died on the cross, changed history forever, and everything is then a repetition of that event because the process has been taken out of the context. So you end up with the mistake of the East, the mistake of the West, and we're thinking big here. We're thinking here, like we always did, John and I, how can we unify East and West, specifically now with the digital age coming? How can we unify East and West through digital? That's been our project for 30 years. And this is why this book, the book that really rewrites all of the history of ideas, is called Process of Event.
Right. Okay. So you elaborated a little bit on the idea of a process. You know, you alluded to the seasonal changes and, you know, the eternal reoccurrence of the same. But then there's also, okay, what an event? What is the specific thing that makes an event an event? So you alluded to, you know, that it maybe change the process before that it changes history. Can you say something to that? What is the...
Sure. I would summarize, we are sons of Deleuze and Foucault. So we're really following in their tradition. And what John and I are doing in our work is that we have to start somewhere with a certain premise. And we don't want to start with the origin. It's not a fairy tale we're doing. We don't have to start with, in the beginning there was. Well, maybe there was a big bang, or maybe it was a big bounce or whatever, and we're stuck with physics and its idea of a beginning. Or maybe there's an end to the whole thing. Could there be an improvement on the consciousness of human beings? Since apparently these humans think that the consciousness that we have is the biggest thing that ever happened. Okay, so both are wrong because they're getting stuck even the beginning or the end of things. Basically, what they're doing is that you get stuck in reductionism. You reduce everything to only one thing. You either reduce everything to physics today, or you reduce everything to consciousness, and then you try to find consciousness absolutely everything, which you can't find. Okay, none of those work. No, we start right here and now where we're located as philosophers. We're sitting in our armchairs with our wine glasses, and what we're doing is that we're saying, shit happens. That's where we start. Shit happens. Then the philosophical question is, what do we mean with shit? And what different types of shit are there? And what does it mean that something happens? Are certain happenings more important to us human beings than other happenings are? And this is the thing. The fact that shit happens is that either shit repeats itself. It's the same shit all over again constantly. That's the process. Or a new type of shit happens. Suddenly something happens that never happened before. And because this thing happened and it seems to stay and hang on and exist, something has emerged. So what we wanted to do with this book was to take the question of emergentism seriously and look at emergentism. And there are other philosophers out there, Adrian Johnson, Terence Duncan, many people who have tried to really phrase what emergentism is to not fall back into reductionism. So we're saying here's a reductionism that falls back into physics, and there's a reverse reductionism that thinks everything is consciousness. They're both wrong. They're called panpsychism and physicalism. Both wrong. No, rather the different things, the many different things. And we're sitting here right now with the liberty to clarify and name the most important differences, which we human beings do. So what we do is that we develop a theory on emergences. These are the most important things that ever happened, the ultimate events. And it turns out the birth of physics, the birth of chemistry, the birth of biology, the birth of, mind, at least some people try to be a mind, the birth of technology in combination with mind. All these things could qualify as emergences that have occurred, undeniably occurred in history. And each one of those emergences has created its own vector. Then we get emergence vectors. And then we realize the universe consists of different emergence vectors that should not be mistaken for one another. Consciousness is worthy of its study as consciousness. What is consciousness? Well, it's not biology. It's clearly something different. It's irreducible to biology. And whenever an emergence occurs, it's irreducible to what existed prior to it. Everything that exists in the universe affects everything else. So everything affects an emergence when an emergence suddenly occurs. For example, the birth of chemistry, the birth of biology. But when something suddenly occurs, it takes off in its own way. It has its own permanence to it. It has its own rules and laws and regulations. It is its own thing. It should be studied as its own thing because it's now its own emergence vector. These are the ultimate events in history. But once we've done that in the book, which is called transcendental emergentism, and we basically killed reductionism, once we've done that, we got that set, we can then start looking at human history. Human beings think through analogs, they think through metaphors. Yeah, exactly. Then we can divide human history into different paradigms. So we can say we're humans, we're basically the same, we haven't changed much, but over the past 10,000 years, we've created something called civilization. And we can then philosophically dissect and check out what civilization is. And then we discover we have 4 clear paradigms that have all led to an explosion in information available to us. We started talking, made us different from animals. We started writing. We started printing what we'd written. And we finally started interacting all the information, which we're doing now with the internet age. All those 4 events are paradigms and paradigm shifts. So we have 4 historical periods called paradigms, and we're shifting right now from one paradigm, which is the printing press paradigm, into the internet paradigm. Brilliant. Then we both have a way of doing human history, and at the same time a way of doing cosmic history. That makes sense. And we've then made a proper emergentist philosophy, which basically covers everything.
Right. So let's pause there for a moment. I want just for a brief moment go back between the relationship between process and events, because I mean there is throughout the book there are many adjacent kind of terms like libido, motido, chronos, kairos. You can even like add order and chaos or repetition and newness, and so there is an oscillation going back and forth between process and events. You know, you can't have the one without having the other. You can't have kairos without chronos. You can't have libido without motido. And so, can you tell us something about the relationship and that oscillation between processes and events?
Yeah. So these are relationships. There are relations in relation to other relationships. That's important to say. We're not just objectively defining something from out of nowhere. I give an example of that. When it comes to phallus and matrix, yin and yang in Latin, the fundamental aspects of sex, of man and woman, if you like. The fundamental aspect of that means that the process is much more on the side of the matrix and the event is much more on the side of the phallus. Okay, sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Well, it isn't, because women give birth to children. And giving birth to children is the ultimate process activity. You give birth to children, then you go old and you die, and your children give birth to children, and then they go old and they die and give birth to children, etc. So if there's anything in the human mind which is a process, it is giving birth to children. That is on women. Women give birth to children, men do not. So this is why we say that if women give birth to children, and that's the most human thing you could ever do, then men obviously envy women for giving birth to children. And because women give birth to children, which is process, men invent technologies, which they do. The vast majority of engineers throughout history and builders and constructors are men. Well, they got nothing better to do. They can't give birth to children. What do? Give birth to technology. So if men give birth to technology, fundamentally, there are women who do that too, but basically it's men who do it. It's on the phallic side. So in the relationship between phallus and matrix, we can then say that in the phallic side of that relationship is the birth of technology. And on the magical side of that relationship is the birth of children. So man and machine have a fundamental relationship, but man is actually closer to woman and machine is closer to man. So this is what we do as philosophers constantly. You try to look at these dichotomies or these contradictions in these relationships, and then you try to look at them in relation to other relationships to try to make sense of them. And this is also why we're saying that motido is more on the side of matrix, whereas libido is more on the side of phallus. We don't mean that women aren't horny. We don't mean that women don't love sex. Oh, sure they do. But when it comes to the way you divide them, when you think of motido and libido is actually more fundamental than libido. So just like process is more fundamental than event, Process is required for an event to happen. Event may happen on top of a process. It's the same thing with man. Man is secondary to woman because woman gives birth to children. Again, motido is fundamental over libido. Therefore, motido is on the side of woman. And when we were looking at that, now proving it through data anthropology, is that most people imagine a female smile when they're born. The person who greets you when you're born is the matriarch. We all imagine deep, deep down that it's a female smile that says, welcome to the world, after the most horrible thing that could ever happen to us, which is birth. Thankfully, we've denied birth. That we can't remember birth because it's so fucking horrible we can't remember it. But there, we see that older woman smiling to us, welcome to the world. And the same thing, the vast majority of people fantasize about a woman, a matriarch standing next to them when they die and telling them to, it's okay, you can let go. And she will tell you whatever story you need to hear at that time. The story you need to hear to let go when you die is a story a matriarch will tell you. Okay, so we have female faces and female gazes and female smiles at the beginning and end of life, but we are fantasizing as we grow up that we want to impress a phallic gaze. It's always the idea of a man, like the sky god is always male, like the sky god. We want to impress the sky god. We want to make an effort to be real men and real women and be grown-ups and take responsibility for ourselves. And the smile that we want to impress is called the phallic gaze. And that's a male smile. And that's why libido is located there, whereas motido is located at the beginning and the end of life.
Right. And so at one point, talking about motido and libido, and you say in the book that the goal of processes is to tame existence, right? What do you mean by that? And what's the goal of the event then?
Well, what returns all the time are all those activities you have to do. Just a lot of this work with process event was imagining what it'd be like to live in a nomadic world where you were constantly on the move. What's kind of shocking is that philosophers never really bothered to try to imagine what it would be to live in a world where everybody's on the move all the time just to survive, and where nobody's lived in any other way either. The whole idea of permanent settlement is a very recent idea historically. It's probably only the last 400 years we even imagined that. So people have been on the move and they migrated constantly throughout history. And we're dealing with that in the book. We can go into it later about exodology, how that's different from nomadology. But fundamentally, there's a tribe here. Chapter 3 of the book, Tribe of Poesis, that chapter discusses the tribe. It's called the sociont these days. If you do paleontology, you discuss sociont because we know that the human tribe, as we know it today, is basically universally shaped and is shaped during a period of a couple of hundreds or thousands of years. And it was inherited by Homo sapiens. And this concept is a tribe size of 1,200 to 1,500 people. It goes down to the Dunbar size, which is exactly 157, which is the clan. And below clan is family, which is 40. And then you can have other forms like the gang, which is 5 people of just one gender and things like that. But basically, family, clan, and tribe are universal forms that return evolutionary development. We don't have any Platonist forms in our philosophy. All our forms are Darwinian. All our forms are shaped by evolution. That's why they succeeded. And that's why they return in human imagination all the time. And we must deal with that. So we have these patterns that come back all the time. And I would say any daily activity in nomadic tribe is about survival. It's either you must survive or you must fix survival for others that then hopefully carry children or do something else that you don't do. But it's all about survival. All about survival. And that survival instinct is so strong that everything that we try to process about that, getting up in the morning, getting out of bed, going out there, going to work, supporting yourself and supporting others, arranging for protection and provision for the tribe, if nothing else, or arranging for reproduction, the third one, which women take care of. So if reproduction and protection provision are fundamental for the tribe's survival, for the society to survive, we are totally pre-programmed to focus on those things. And our lives are meaningless without those activities. That's process for you. Right. Constantly. Every generation goes back to those same things. And that's why we can't fight those things either.
Right. And so just for future sake, when we talk about processes, we talk about nomadology. When we talk about events, that's eventology, right?
Exactly. Because eventology was not thought anywhere until Zoroaster.
Right. We come to this.
We don't see a single person in history who thinks eventology. before Zoroaster does that 1700 before Christ, and he invents philosophy as a consequence of it, because that's
Right.
when
We will
philosophy starts.
keep that in mind. We will come to that. The next,
Yeah.
the thing that I wanted to round up this thing is, so the nomadology, the processes, you say it's the gainplex moving through the landscape, whereas eventology, the events, is like the memeplex moving through the mental landscape. And
Exactly.
and so it's like it's another aspect of what you were just saying, but can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, being human is two things. The geneplex changes very, very, very slowly, if at all. We can even afford to call ourselves constants, because we haven't changed in the past 10,000 years much at all. We're actually smaller, most of us, than 10,000 years ago, and our brains have gotten smaller. So smartphones are replacing that. But the geneplex is there. It's almost like a constant. It moves very, very gradually, glacially, right? So the memeplex, though, moves a lot faster, especially these days, because new ideas pop up all the time. And if an idea is transported from you to me and onwards, the complex where that idea sort of fits in is a memeplex. An idea is a meme. A memeplex is a set of memes that belong together. For example, here, parallax, or the book, Process Event. They're all memeplexes, right? So human beings are those two things. And to make it easier to understand humans, and also to create a philosophy which is human-friendly, our ambition here is to help human beings understand each other better. Then we're saying that nomadology in itself didn't need a philosopher, because nomadology is what we were taught for like 1 million years as human beings, that this is how the world works, and the elders are here and you must obey them, you must submit to them, otherwise they'll kill you or whatever. But that's how a tribe works, a society works. So anything like that is not something philosophers have to discuss and write down, because it's the obvious thing. Like the sun goes up every day, the sun goes down every night. Well, that's nomadology. Anything you can put into that category of nomadology, we can put that on one side, is also closer tied to the geneplex. We're all pre-programmed, biologically, evolutionarily developed, to understand those things. It doesn't take much of an effort for us to do that, because that's the geneplex. It's just there. But on top of that, we have to be plastic. We have to, change our minds about things around us. There's information coming in different directions all the time. We have to be prepared for that change. And that is the beginning, before we start thinking the event properly and start constructing philosophy because of it. That's the part of our lives, the plasticity of our minds is where the memeplex belongs. The plasticity means that we can learn something we didn't know before. We can read a book and we can learn that book, and we know things we didn't know before, because we absorbed a meme we didn't have before. So geneplex and memeplex are the two things we work with. And when we then move on to values and valuations, what we're saying is that human beings have two types of values. The values that are tied to the nomadology and the process, which were always there. If we don't give birth to children, we die out. So we better have a society which is friendly to giving birth to children. That must be the first value of any given society. Otherwise, the society dies out. Okay, we call those archetypology, because they're tied to archetypes. We're born with archetypes: man, woman, old, young, nature, culture. All the archetypes around us are there. They've been there all along. They've been there since the beginning of civilization. They won't change. And therefore, they're archetypes, and we can put them into a system we could call archetypology. So you must love your family, otherwise your family will, throw you out of the family, whatever. Those kind of values are universal, and those values are nomadological, and therefore they belong to the archetypes. The other part, though, is that because events do happen, history changes forever. We leave one paradigm, move into another paradigm. Our lives today are very, very different from, say, 500 years ago. We have smartphones, laptops, everything around us today. None of those things existed 50 years ago. Okay, that's difference. And that difference is what we call paradigms. And therefore, the study of the values that are temporary, depending on the paradigm, are called paradigmatics. How do you become successful within a certain paradigm? How do you become successful in the digital age? How do you become a netocrat, as we call it, rather than a consummarian? How do you train your children to be successful in the digital age? Those are things people want to know. Well, it's a philosophical responsibility to tell you. And we say, okay, you got to figure out the paradigmatics of the digital age. What are the specific values that are going to be now put at the forefront that didn't exist before, or at least didn't exist in the combination they exist now? And that's paradigmatics. And then we can look at human values and realize that any human society has a certain archetypology, which tends to be quite universal, very little variation, but a great variation when it comes to paradigmatics. So, for example, if you try to force liberal democracy on Afghanistan, and nobody in Afghanistan can even read a newspaper, and no newspaper is being published, when you know that the newspaper being published in the morning, read by people who could read and write, was the very condition for creating a liberal democracy. You're just being stupid. You're going to Afghanistan with the wrong paradigm. And if you apply the wrong paradigmatics onto a system, it goes into total collapse. And this is what you need to do when you do values evaluations. You've got to look at a society and say, where is this society at the moment? The vast majority of people, where are they located? Can we communicate with them in such a way that they can grow and expand, that we hit the right paradigm?
So what's the relationship between the memeplex moving through the mental landscape and libido? That's the question that's not quite clear yet, because as far as I understand, you need the event and you need libido to create new archetypes also, and on new processes, in the sense that you could even allude to the idea that processes are old events, composed of old events maybe. So how is the memeplex moving dependent on libido? That's the question I want to ask.
Well, we can start with what motivo is. The death drive in Freud is the motivo. We say motivo instead. It's a better word. And it's fundamental. Libido is a denial of the motivo. Because when we're born, the first thing that happens to us is we want to die. And then we have to deny that. And because we denied that, because that matriarch is smiling to us, welcome us to the world, and we say, okay, I can't kill myself, I better live. That's the switch from motivo to libido. Libido is a functioning denial that should work. That's the beauty of it. So motivo, first of all, is a life where nothing ever happens, you just live. So motidinal existence, according to Freud, is that, well, today is exactly like yesterday. I'm not going to make it any different. I don't want it to change. I don't want any events. I don't want any emergencies. I don't want anything to happen to me. I want everything to be exactly like it was yesterday. And I'm neurotically going to hang on to it. And I just want this day to be exactly like yesterday was. And I'd just be irritated if anything happens to me. So that's motivo. It's right. Like a lifeless life, zombie-like. It's like you can't even care to kill yourself. That's pure motivo. It just your life just goes on. And you don't want anything new, anything novel to happen to you, anything to change. Libido, therefore, is this embrace of change. It's just like, oh, I'm bored with this now. I'm going to try something entirely different and see what that is. And this was, interesting enough, Zoroaster's argument when he discovered the event. He was not moralizing against the process. The beauty of Zoroaster, which is what we also subscribe to, the book is called Process and Event. We say both worldviews are correct. We don't want to choose between the two. That's over. The East and the West chose. That was a mistake. You need to keep both. What Zoroaster says is that we have tried process. We have done process. Why don't we try something new? And of course, he's a man. It comes from a very masculine fantasy, like, well, we've tried the other things. We've done tradition. We've done repetition of the same. Why don't we just, for a change, try something new? It might go totally wrong, might blow ourselves up, whatever, but why don't we try it? And that urge to just try something new is on the side of libido. And when you think about sexuality, it has this strong urge in it, both female and male libido, doesn't matter. But libido itself has this urge in it, like, yeah, there's something about it that if you do that one act and you go through all the way through with it, a new life could come out of it. And I mean, that's the closest we ever get to an eternity, because we will die. We will die one day. We're all going to die. But we might put a new life into this world that survives us and buries us. And that urge is therefore urge towards novelty. There's a relationship between the idea of giving birth to something new and for novelty itself to exist.
Right. So when did these notions, or let's call them meta-narratives or ideas, first emerge in philosophy, and how do they reverberate as these meta-ideas like in philosophies today?
Okay, so the Persians invented the philosophy of process and event. They had no desire whatsoever to kill process. We don't see any trace of that at all in Persian thinking the first 1,000 years. What happens is that there's not that much written material left. So Persian philosophy is a bit like doing archaeology, to try to find out actually the different patterns and unite them. But we do know the Greeks inherited it. And Heraclitus especially, I'm personally, I subscribe to the idea that Heraclitus was not even Greek. He was a Persian. He was probably Kurdish, to be honest about it. It's most likely. He was Median, as we say. But it turns out the pre-Socratic philosophers didn't even think of themselves as Greeks yet. There wasn't a Greek identity. That comes with Plato and Socrates later. But they were doing prose and event. You can read Heraclitus fragments in Zoroaster's Gothos, and the Gothos is at least 1,200 years older. Well, we don't even know when Heraclitus fragments were written, but they were collected about 1,000 years later, and they were turned into Greek philosophy from a guy who hated the Greeks and thought the Persians were better, Heraclitus. But Heraclitus was still doing flux. So what we're arguing is that we have perceived that philosophy started with Plato or something, and with Platonist forms, and with the idea of eternal perfection, and those ideas that Plato researched. But our argument is that that's actually the mistake. The mistakes start right there, because what Plato is doing is the event without the process. It starts with Plato, and it leads to the Abrahamic religions and on to Christianity and Islam, with the dualism that comes with that, which is that there's a separation between body and mind, and the totally separate substances, which is the requirement for thinking event without the process. And we go through all of that in detail in the book. You can dig into it if you're really interested in it, because our argument is that we're standing with Nietzsche, that Heraclitus is the beginning of Greek philosophy. But what Heraclitus calls philosophia in Greek, which means the love of wisdom, is Mazda Yasna in ancient Persian. So the Persians did invent philosophy, and philosophy was also kick-started both in India and China before the Greeks started accumulating their texts and started debating. So Greece, the idea of Greece as the beginning of philosophy is basically European 19th century fantasy, because we included Greece in our idea of Europe, and that was Lord Byron's idea in the 1820s, but it has no connection to what actually happened historically. But Heraclitus, Zoroaster and Heraclitus, and the philosophy of flux is the original philosophy. Only later with Plato, Parmenides especially, do we have a philosophy of eternal forms. This is very, very important. This is a total shift in writing the history of philosophy. My understanding, flux is the original version of it. And in the East, the history of flux was all there was. Indian and Chinese philosophy dominated completely by the history of flux. And a perfect example of that is Buddhist and Taoist thinking. Buddhist thinking coming out of India and Taoist thinking coming out of China are both large spiritual schools of flux and how to handle the fact that the world is changing all the time.
So that would be the process side of things. And then you mentioned Zoroastrian, the approach and the invention of events and eventology.
Yeah, so the interesting division happens with the Aryan or Indo-European or Indo-Iranian, if you like, tribes that walked south from central Siberia and crossed over the Hindu Kush. And they slightly went to the west, which became Iran, and they slightly went to the south, which became northern India. And the interesting thing when you study Indian and Persian philosophy is that the Indians eventually decided to go with process only, and the Iranians developed the process and event as a dichotomy, dialectical philosophy. And these are the beginnings of philosophy. And this is the beginning of the East and the West. So the beginning of the West is Persia, and the beginning of the East is India. And from India, East moves on to China and Japan, often influenced by Persia. And Persian thinking moves on to the West and becomes eventually Abrahamic thinking, and Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy, etc., and moves on to the West. But we're saying essentially that the division between West and East is fundamental division between Persia and India that occurs a little more than 4,000 years ago. About 200 to 300 years only after Iran and India go separate ways, Zoroaster appears. Probably somewhere around contemporary Uzbekistan. This is Central Asia. Everybody spoke ancient Persian. This was Persian culture. And he appears there, and he and his best friend Vishtaspa create the first school of philosophy known to mankind. So Persia is the beginning of philosophy, which the Greeks later beautifully inherit, but it's a Persian origin.
Right. Okay, so the question that I hope is on everybody's mind is, how does this oscillation or this integration of or dialectics between these two ideas and notions, how does it play out in our daily life, in the sociont, in the original tribe, in the world that we're living in, and what should enable us to do with these kinds of ideas? Like what are we to gain with this focus on processes and events?
Well, we are allergic to any idea that human beings are tabula rasa. We hate Rousseau. We're dealing with Plato. Plato's rich. There's so many sides of Plato. You can never stop doing Plato. He's wonderful. But we're dealing with Rousseau here fundamentally. We don't believe in the tabula rasa. And for example, this idea of social constructivism that's so prevalent in society today is dead wrong and very, very dangerous historically. We're not all alike. We're not all the same. We're not born blank sheets. We're born with genes. We're born with sexes. You know, we are so different from one another in so many different ways, because that is how a tribe survives. The socion survives through variety. To use a popular term, it makes the socion anti-fragile. So when we do nomadology, we need to fundamentally boil it down to something that is the universal beginning of what we call religion. Religion as the form, the narrative through which we organize the tribe. And our argument is that the simplest form that occurs constantly in all cultures and comes back again and again is a triad. Dialect is always about 3 rather than 2. And therefore, between man and woman, there's a split. And that split is on the male side. Even some Chinese philosophers today agree on this, and therefore they take in the yin and the yang, and they say, well, you got the yin and you got the yang, but actually yang is yang and yang, because yang and yang must be 2 different things. We totally agree with this worldview. And this opens up a very interesting part in Protestant event, which is how we deal with the tyrant and the problem with the tyrant historically, and why we don't want the tyrant, and why the tyrant is bad news for any civilization. What we're saying is that for the tribe to move forward, think of dramatically move forward, you put the matriarch at the very end. You put the oldest woman at the very end, and you say anybody who's behind her is dead. And the way you describe that nomadologically is by saying that behind the matriarch, there's chaos. There's always a woman. There's always a goddess. Chaos is always a goddess. And that's simply because we want to terrify everybody so they walk faster than the matriarch does. Because if the tempo she walks at, that's like the minimum speed forward in the tribe. So matriarch is the bad. You only need 1 matriarch. You don't need 2. Why? Because she's not leading. She's not leading. She's picking up. She's holding. It's like female bosses are good at that too. Sometimes it can be very costly because they have too many meetings, but female bosses are good at making sure that everybody in the workplace feels they're part of the team. There's a strong feminine thing to that. So if she walks at the end, the question is who leads? Well, it turns out that the 2 different types of leaders historically that always return. And we call them the priest and the chief. The priest is simply the smartest guy, and the chief is the strongest guy. So the chief leads the warriors and the hunters because they got to go out there and they got to hunt and they got to go to war, because otherwise we don't survive. But the priest backs up the chief because the priest is the smartest guy. He's got the strategy for how we survive. So we basically look for the smartest guy, the wisest guy, that's also usually an older guy who is the priest. And then we look for who's the strong guy, big muscles, younger, at his peak in life. Okay, he's the chief. And chief and priest must be separated. So the funny thing is, to the tribe, the first separation is not between man and woman or between patriarch and matriarch, between mother and father. The first division within the tribe is between the priest and chief, both on the male side, because they must lead. Still today, guy leads the tango, woman follows. There's nothing wrong with following at all. It's on a par, it's equal with leading. Leading is not superior in any way. That's a ridiculous idea. It's one of the bad ideas on Plato, that leading should be something superior, should we aspire to lead. No, good leaders do not aspire to lead at all. Good leaders are asked to lead, they hate it, but they do it anyway because they're the best person to do it. And that's why the good priest, the good chief do not aspire to be priest and chief. We appoint them because they're the best guys to be priest and chief. So there's a priestly function and there's a chiefly function. And that's how leadership must be. And then we have a separation and we avoid having a tyrant, because a tyrant is the guy who wants to be both priest and chief at the same time, aspire to both, kills everybody else to get to that position, and then hell breaks loose and we all go down. So priest and chief must be separated. Once priest and chief is separate, at least among men, we are masculine male philosophers. We expect women to do their version of philosophy as they would do, but we do for men here. And we say the next definition that we must separate is warrior and hunter. If you unite the two, you get mass slaughter, Mongol invasions and shit throughout history. So you try to separate the warrior and the hunter. And by separating warrior and hunter, you can also separate priest and chief. So they strengthen each other by the separations. And the third category of separation is man and woman, because sexuality lies in the realm of the reward. Evenings, worked hard, protected, provided, sexuality. Kids gone to bed, sexuality, right? It lies in the reward system, which we fuck up, of course, as modern human beings, because we go straight to jerking off to porn in the morning when we wake up, and everything is fucked up because we don't understand that sexuality must belong to a reward system archetypologically, otherwise we fuck it up. And these are the archetypes that John and I insist we must stay with and don't fight with, because then we just cruel to ourselves. So we laid out nomadology for you. You got the matriarch at the end, you got the priest and chief at the front, you got everybody else in between on the move, you got the warriors and the hunters, and you got 4 different patriarchs because of that, because you got a warrior priest and a hunter priest, you got a warrior chief and a hunter chief, and that's a patriarchy. Matriarchy is just the matriarch herself. The oldest, wisest woman, and you don't fuck with her. Why? Because ultimate power is with her, because it is to the matriarch that all the men, including the priest and chief, deliver. The delivery is to her, so she lets her daughters loose, and sexuality can occur, and reproduction can occur.
But we're still talking about archetypes, and that means that even, or that especially women can be, or the biological sex is not dependent on the archetype. You can be a woman and still be a leader.
Sure, but you're probably lesbian if you are.
Right.
Probably. And if you're a guy who hangs out in the village square with the girls or hang out with their babies on the back, you're probably gay. The brilliance with our philosophy is that we have places for gays people and for lesbians everywhere in our models. And we have places for people called shamanoid people. We developed that in the previous book, to Libido. We've actually did it with data anthropology. We've proven it. Every population, human population, the Saucian returns. The Saucian consists of 92% regular Joes and Jills, heterosexual men and women who can't think of anything else. 4% are LGBT, and 4% are shaman. That returns in every population. We proved that. We did Libido, the previous book. So we take that with us in here. What's important here, though, is that now when we discuss nomadology, we discuss priest, chief, matriarch. Please note that there's not an event anywhere in this model. The model is totally process-oriented. And Hinduism, to a large part, is this. Pagan religion is this. Paganism and Hindu religion are basically process. And we respect that. There's nothing wrong with that worldview. It's how the world operated until very recently. It's just that now events have happened.
Well, the advent of the internet and the digital age is an event.
It is an event.
And so you need libidinal energy, and you need leaders and priests to lead the way, and also you need matriarchs to bring it all together. So where are the matriarchs in that move towards the digital?
Well, I'd say Kamil Paga, for example, is a thinker and anthropologist who agrees with us very heavily on this thing, that feminism must complete itself by going back to worshiping the mother, because the mother is the most desirable human being we could ever think of. You can't beat the mother. You know, the father figure, after all, only competes with the mother figure through his technology, but he's not reproducing the way a mother is. So we are totally with that worldview and totally subscribe to it. I think, Paga, we agree here. We're Nietzscheans, all of us anyway. What we do in our philosophy is that we lay out the archetypes, say, don't fight these things. Don't be nasty to yourself. Don't be nasty to the humans. If you're a human being, you want to create a humane society, don't fight the archetypes. Realize that process is very much there. Things are returning to the same point. There are points to traditions. There are good arguments for it, but because events do happen in history, and then not just the sort of positive events of new technologies like new information technologies that speed up the process of knowledge, and we learn more and we become smarter because our technologies are teaching us to be smart and all that. You know, the intelligence we're now producing, the symbiotic intelligence we're going to produce, and man and machine work together and machines get smarter. You know, all those things that happen look like positive events. But we have also dramatic events that actually are the bad news. We would say the most obvious event that happened in the last 100 years happened on August the 6th, 1945, and it's called the atomic bomb. And the name we have for that is Hiroshima. Suddenly the pictures were there. We've blown up 100,000 people in a second. Okay, that means we can now blow ourselves up across the entire planet and humanity can go extinct through its own actions. We've never been able to do this before. Climate change and all that's nothing compared to the bomb. In our philosophy, the bomb is a central event. That means what we said in the synthesis book was that if the bomb already is there, if the devil has been created by us and has existed since 1945 and is catching up with us because there are more and more devils out there, more and more bombs out there, finally they might all go off. If that happens, we're done. Now, if we created the devil, can we then create God in response? And it's, according to us, a fight against the clock. It's a fight against time for human beings to create a God that can stop the devil. Okay, which is what we try to do with technology, right? So if technology can stop the bomb and lock up the bombs necessarily so they don't go off, then humanity will be better off and we've saved ourselves. And this is what we do when we do theology. We do a theology on technology. That's what John and I are doing.
Okay, so again, how do we translate all of this into our daily life? So more specifically, how do we get to know our archetypes? You know, our role within the socio and the tribe.
Well, you can't sit there and narcissistically invent your archetype and go into wishful thinking, because then you're certainly going to fail. At least with young men who come to me and ask for advice, I say that the archetype can only be found by you sitting down with 6 or 7 other men that actually are honest enough to speak the truth to you. And they will tell you what kind of archetypes you could aspire to. And my recommendation is to think of it like you do when you go to college in America. You have a major and a minor, 2 specialties. Your major is your primary archetype. It's that which you do with ease. It's not a big thing for you, but everybody else is impressed. If you got a talent, that when you go into that talent, when you do that, it's just the funniest, nicest thing in the world for you to do. It's just the easiest thing in the world. And everybody is just like, wow, how did you do that? That's your primary archetype. Okay? The secondary archetype is that what you can do with effort, but it takes effort for you to do it. You probably need to get educated. Your profession is usually part of the secondary archetype if you're lucky. The secondary archetype is something you could do. So if somebody asks in the room, can anybody do this? You'll sit there and say, yeah, I could do that. And you're looking for somebody else to do it because there might be somebody who has that primary archetype. And if there isn't anybody there who raise their hand, and you say, okay, I could do that. It's my secondary archetype. With some effort, I could take responsibility and do that. That's your secondary archetype. So try to look for those 2, a primary and secondary archetype, but you can only find them by filtering them through other people. This is the beauty of the social. You are your own blind spot in our philosophy. You
can't create your primary archetype. That's
you can't create your archetype at all, and you cannot invent it, and you can't go through wishful thinking. You know, I was in the music industry for 25 years. I listened to thousands and thousands of demo tapes from people who thought they were rock stars, but they were crap. So, you know, knowing that we live in an incredibly narcissistic society where capitalism and the internet itself has made us believe in ourselves even more and think we're so fucking awesome and all that, when in reality we're just mediocre at best. You know, I would advise you strongly today, if you're a young person, not to think you can make up your archetype. It's none of those fairy tale things. You can't go to Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings to find your archetype. You know, men's work 20 years ago was a bit like that. Was embarrassing, to be honest. Today, men's work that I work with all across Europe is all about finding your proper archetype. It is really who you are in relation to other people. Man and woman are, of course, archetypes too. And for those people who are confused about their archetype in that regard, I'm willing to take them through transition, through psychoanalysis. We've invented trans man and trans woman, totally pro it because of totally pro LGBT people. But I would say the vast majority of people are either men or women are comfortable with that. And those are strong archetypes in society.
Would you, in closing, would you agree that that when you are able, that your primary archetype is where you are able to create an event?
Not necessarily. I would say that men are probably more likely to hope for that than women are. Whereas women probably say, my primary archetype is when I inherit something and I'm the one doing it in my generation.
Right.
You see how that's closer to feminine and is foundational? First, you must have somebody who does represent tradition and who does what needs to be done, who does reproduce the world. This lies on the feminine side, and that's why it's the foundation for human. It's only on top of that that another sex can exist, which is the man who steps up and he fantasizes much more about the event than the woman does. But women love events. But if you look at women, when they talk about events, they usually mean things like birthdays, Christmas, Easter, whatever, holidays and things, which are, of course, repeated every year. So they're on the side of process. The event is really something unique that happens that never happened before. And of course, the fact that something happens can be both a process and event. It can both be a Christmas party. At the same time, it could be that unique Christmas party where you get really drunk and told your grandmother what you really thought about or whatever. So they can be event-like qualities to something that happens, and they can be process-like qualities. And we've talked before that we think the world is so much richer if people can think, process, and event simultaneously like the Persians tried. That's our goal with our philosophy, is to try to make people think both. Try to make people think both libido mortido, try to make people think dialectical relationships everywhere and enjoy them. And this is also our own personal dialectic, is the archetype versus the paradigm. Who are you historically? Who would you have been 2,000 years ago with your talents? And who are you today? Are those talents that would have been, fantastic 2,000 years ago, are they worthless today? Or are they even more cherished than ever, more valued than ever? I can't tell. All I can tell a young man who comes to me in men's work is I can tell him that I can assure you, because you wouldn't be here today if evolution hadn't survived. I can assure you that 5,000 years ago, you had a role in the tribe. We can figure out which that one is, but I can't guarantee you still have a role today. It's your own job to find out if you do have a role today, something meaningful you would do where you can shine with your talents. And I can guarantee that because we've automized so many things, the technology takes such a large part of human existence that, a lot of talents have become redundant, to be honest about it. And therefore, people have to reinvent their archetypes today in a new paradigmatic setting. And this is why we use these words. Archetype here, paradigm there. Don't mix the two. Well, mix them, but keep them separate when you do. You are both.
Fantastic.